Watercolor is such a versatile medium and can be so much fun to work in. Painting with watercolors can feel like such a therapeutic and relaxing experience, or it can feel like a stressful, frustrating nightmare. If you feel like your watercolors are controlling you rather than the other way around, and that every painting you do is very hit or miss and can easily become an overworked mess, then this video is for you. Because the problem you are probably facing is a lack of planning. It is important to plan your paintings first before starting to add lots of paint to your paper. Don't get me wrong. Part of the fun of watercolors is the unknown and letting the paint work its magic and swirl around the paper. But if you have no control or planning, then it will be very hard to get your vision to come to life on paper. So I'm going to go through 8 tips for planning your watercolors. These will be 8 things to consider and think about before you jump into the painting process. It can be easy to just grab your watercolor supplies and get started. But it's important to first think about what the best supplies for your project are. Starting with paper. Do you want to do a big or small painting? What paper surface do you think would work best for your painting? For example, smooth portraits may look better on hot press paper, which has less texture. Or more expressive paintings could look more appealing on cold pressed paper. If you plan on adding lots of water to your paper, for example, then you also need to think about the thickness of your paper. The next supply to consider is your paint. If you have multiple options, then you need to think about which one would work best for what you're painting. For larger paintings, tube paint might be the better option, as you can really quickly mix up a large amount of paint in one go. Or if you plan to paint outdoors, a pan set of paints could be more convenient. Another important thing to think about is the size of your brushes. If you're painting a large area, you may want to use a paintbrush that is larger so that it is easier and faster to paint that area. Or if you're painting tiny little details, then you'll need a smaller paintbrush. So think about what the appropriate size paintbrush would be for each element of your painting. Finally, think about any additional watercolor supplies you may need. For example, a common supply I use for my watercolor paintings is masking fluid, which really helps to preserve the little highlights in your painting. So thinking about these things before you start will allow you to gather all of the supplies you may need and get them all prepared before you start the painting process. Once you have gathered all of your supplies that you'll need for the painting, the next step is to come up with the sketch of your reference. Creating a sketch will help act as the foundation of your painting, and it is really important to start with an accurate sketch before you go in and add lots of paint. So make sure that you don't rush over this step. You can either create a sketch directly on your watercolor paper, or what I recommend doing instead is creating a sketch on some cheaper paper like printer paper, anything will do, and then transfer your sketch onto your expensive watercolor paper once you're happy that your sketch is accurate. Sketching out your subject matter is a really important step of the planning process, and it's very hard to create a great painting without it. It is useful to test the colours you want to use before jumping into a painting. Testing how to mix the right colours first will give you more confidence and allow you to work more effectively when working on the actual painting. It can take a bit of experimentation to figure out how to mix the colours you want. Instead of doing all of this experimentation during the final painting, it is best to test out your different colours on some scrap paper before you dive into your painting. That way you won't feel so under pressure to mix your paint really quickly and perfectly when you're doing your painting, and it will allow you to really figure out the colour combinations you need to mix without having to feel on a time constraint. For example, the wet in wet watercolour method involves you working quite quickly whilst the paper is still wet. This method is useful because it allows you to avoid harsh watercolour edges by painting on a pre-wet surface so that you get really nice, smooth colour transitions. But like I said, you can only do this whilst the paper is still wet, so you have to make sure to mix colours quickly and get in all of your layers very fast before the paper dries. So if you're also trying to mix all of the different colours and experiment during this time, then you won't have the time to actually do the technique effectively. The paper will dry too fast and you'll just need to rush mixing your colours and rush the actual application process. That is why it's better to test your colours first and mix them before you start painting an area so that you don't have to rush the actual painting process. With watercolours, it is really important to make sure that you preserve the brightest white sparkly highlights in your reference, because once you start adding watercolour to a highlighted area, it can be very hard to lift it back up and get that bright highlight back without painting on top of it with white paint. With highlights, it's most effective to allow the white of the paper to show through in these areas to give a really natural looking highlight. In order to make sure that you avoid adding paint to highlighted areas, you need to actually identify these brighter areas before you start adding paint. If you don't identify these lighter values before you paint, then you can easily paint over them by mistake. So before you start your painting process, take a look at your reference and identify the brightest areas in the photo. Any tiny highlighted details or larger light areas, make a note of them, and when you're painting, be really aware of where these areas are so that you don't accidentally paint over them. As well as your highlights, it is really important to know where all of the main values are in your reference. In order to create a painting that has a good contrast, you need to have a variety of lights and darks throughout your painting. It's really important to identify the lightest and darkest areas of your reference. Knowing your highlights and shadows before you start painting means that when you mix your paints, you can make sure that you make them dark enough for the shadowed areas. This will help ensure that your painting has depth. If you struggle identifying the values of your paintings, then I recommend turning your reference to black and white, because comparing colours in one scale, like the grayscale, is a whole lot easier than trying to compare colours of all different hues. One of the most important things to plan before you start your painting is what techniques you want to use to create each element of your painting. Rather than just diving in and starting throwing paint around, it is important to think about which technique would be best suited to painting each part of your reference. For example, I mentioned earlier that you can use masking fluid to preserve tiny highlights in your reference. This is a technique that you need to think about before you start your painting, because masking fluid is something that needs to be applied to the paper before you even start adding paint. So if you hadn't planned to use this technique beforehand, then it might be too late and you may forget to add the masking fluid or not even think of masking fluid as an option. And you can make the painting process a lot more difficult by not planning. Instead of this easier method, without thinking beforehand, you might end up just trying to paint around every little highlight, which would take more time. So thinking a little bit about what techniques you want to use beforehand may help you come up with more effective and easier ideas and options of things to try for your painting that you may not have thought about when you're in the thick of it, in the heat of the moment, just working on an area, making quick decisions on the fly. Another thing to consider when picking the best techniques for your area that you're painting is whether the area you are painting has more of a soft colour change or whether it has more sharp details. This will determine whether it is best to use, say, the wet on wet painting method or the wet on dry technique. Also, for any textured area like foliage or a snowy sky, you can plan and experiment with what tools you could use to create these textures. What do you want to paint first? Do you want to create an underpainting and build your painting up in layers? When thinking about what to paint first, think about your reference photo and the techniques that you plan to use. For example, if you plan on painting a forest, you may wish to start by painting the trees farthest in the distance and then gradually work your way to painting the foreground. This means that you can paint the elements with less clarity first and then paint the more detailed areas last. Or plan your order based on the techniques you want to use. For example, I always like to paint any areas that I'm using the wet on wet technique for first. In animal paintings, this means I paint the background first, or with portraits, it means I paint the skin first. It is important to do this technique first because it involves wetting the paper. So if you painted tiny details first and then tried to do the wet on wet technique after, you run the risk of wetting the details, which would cause the colours to bleed and lose definition. As a rule of thumb, I paint any smooth, soft areas first. These are the areas where I am applying a wash of colour or using the wet and wet method, and then I paint all of the tiny details and textures afterwards. The final thing to consider when planning is whether you want to use any other medium with your watercolour paint. You don't always have to paint everything with watercolours. If you think another medium would help create an area more effectively, then use it. For example, with my portraits, I often use coloured pencils to add the tiny details like eyebrows and eyelashes, which would be a lot more difficult to add in with a paintbrush. You could use pencils to add detail and definition to your painting, or you could add in inks like metallics or other bright, vibrant colours to make your paintings pop more, or you could use gouache to add highlights or little details like stars. So don't limit yourself. There is no rule saying you need to stick to just one medium. Have fun and get creative. Doing these 8 things will make it much more likely that you create a painting that you are proud of and actually have a relaxing time doing it. A bit of planning will save you so many headaches whilst painting, but also remember to let your watercolours work their magic. They can't be controlled entirely. Now, if you are a beginner with watercolours and you want a bit more guidance with how to start your painting and just the whole painting process in general and the different techniques, then I recommend checking out my free watercolour class that I created for you guys. It is a 2-hour real-time painting demonstration that you can follow along with and learn all of the techniques that you need to create amazing expressive watercolor paintings and improve your watercolor skills. So I'll leave a link to that at the top of the description, or you can get it by clicking here, and it's just a really fun, relaxing project that you can have a go at and build confidence with your watercolors. So check it out, and I will see you guys in the next video.